You all to this book event. We call it a book Adda, following the South Asian tradition. And I'm welcoming not only those who are in person here, but many more who are watching online. I'm Ashutosh Varshne, Director of the Center for Contemporary South Asia, soon to be Saxena Center, starting July. I've been meaning to hold this discussion on the internment of Chinese Indians for almost 2 years. COVID interrupted our plans repeatedly. Dilip, Souza got in touch with me 2 years ago, just as the book was about to come out. And I was very keen on sponsoring this event on behalf of the center. Two things can be said right away about, in my judgment, why this discussion is important. We know a lot about the Japanese-American internment after Pearl Harbor. Roughly 112,000 Japanese Americans were interned on the West Coast and about 1,500 in Hawaii. A lot has been written about it. Official apology has come from American government, also for the internment. But the story of the internment of Chinese Indians after the Sino-Indian War is not known. Very little is known. We should, as a matter of historical record, as a matter of knowledge about how India functioned at a certain point of time, we should know quite a lot more. The second reason is a political sciencey reason, and let me explain. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, from 47 to 64, is viewed by political scientists all over the world as one of the finest liberal Democrats ever to rule. But those who've studied Nehru, while agreeing generally with that view, have also found, at least I'm writing about it, 3 lapses in his liberal democratic record. 2 are known. One is the incarceration of Sheikh Abdullah without legal proceedings. Second, suspension of Kerala government after the second general elections in India. And the third, internment of Chinese Indians in Rajasthan. And that third lapse, I first spoke about at London School of Economics some 4 or 5 years ago. I did not have enough information. I knew something about it, but this book that we are discussing today throws a fresh light on it, and in a very impressive manner. So let me introduce the panelists. Joyma and Dilip Souza are the co-writers of this book. Joyma was born in the camp, in the Deoli camp. The book is called Deoliwallahs, those who were in Deoli. That is the right pronunciation, right? Deoli. In Rajasthan. And she was born there, and she has been living in San Francisco Bay Area with a husband and 2 sons for quite some time now. She was educated in India until she left for graduate school in the United States. Dilip Souza is a Brown alum. Before coming to Brown, he was educated in Pilani, BITS Pilani, I suppose. So that means engineering right away. He was a computer scientist. And now has been writing for a long time in a very distinguished manner on political and social issues, on travel, on sports, and on mathematics, and has won several awards, including Statesman Rural Reporting Award, Outlook Picador India Non-Fiction Prize, Newsweek Daily Beast South Asian Commentary Prize, and has published 8 books, including Deoliwallahs. I will introduce the discussants when they, as they come up to speak. The format is that we'll have Joy and Dilip speaking for 45 minutes, roughly, plus minus. We'll also have another survivor of the camp speaking for 5 minutes, Michael, right? Then we'll turn to Sarah Besky first, and then Payal Banerjee for their commentary. So without any further delay, welcome Dilip and Joy. You can either speak from here or from there, whatever you find more appropriate or convenient.
Well, thank you to everyone at Brown for having us here, and thanks for joining this session. Wanted to talk about our book, and one of the first questions I get asked is, why did we write this book? So for me, having born in the camp is, we call it the camp, right? And so among the community, we would call ourselves the Campwallahs or Deoliwallahs. And so since I was born in the camp's not really far away from me, because my mother used to tell me stories when I was a child about how, she would educate me about it, make a connection between me and my brothers. And these were funny stories. I would, try to embrace it and, think about the camp as an entity almost. And then every time it was my birthday, she would tell me, okay, so it's about 10:30 at night. I had to get a permit from your father to get a permit for me to go. And then I said, oh, did he go with you to the hospital? And the hospital was outside the gates, the walls of the camp. And she said, no, he walked me to the gate. And so from the gate, she went by herself. So I've also been asked by a lot of people to write about this. And it was actually pretty difficult to write because it's not a very public kind of topic outside of our circles. It's kind of quite a conversation killer, but also it's remarkably difficult. I was just talking to Payal, and it is the reactions that we got in those early days were really difficult. It's hard to sell the story in the U.S. because nobody knew about it. Hence, they couldn't trust it. There was no outlet. But I think what really was the breakthrough was when I realized it's just not my story to tell or not to tell. It's a story of a community. And when I got in touch with the AIDCI, the Association of Chinese Deoli camp internees. Okay, sorry about that. I should learn this.
I know better than you.
You do, yes. You were doing the research.
It's a good sign.
Yeah.
So when I met those folks, I met a bunch of people who were finally willing to talk about it. And so from that, I felt that I could represent their stories. I could listen to them and tell their stories. And then I met Dilip, and Dilip has his own story about why he wrote this book.
So again, let me again be formal and thank you, Ashutosh, for having us. You mentioned that I'm an alumnus of Brown. Yeah, I did computer science just up the street when I came here. I think I was the first Indian grad student in the computer science department, and I believe the next two Indian grad students were also called Dilip. So there was a requirement that they had to be named Dilip, yeah, apparently. But anyway, thank you for having us. It's such a pleasure to be back on the Brown campus. So why did I write this book? Why did I want to write this book? I mean, I think this is really a story about silences, this is a story that I should have known growing up in India, and I should have known as a journalist who thinks he knows something about India. And it astounded and ashamed me that in 2012, when I first heard about the story, that I had never heard about it, and I had, that it had not been taught to me in my history books, in history lessons in school. So that was this idea that this whole thing had been kept silent for so long troubled me, and I felt like I had to do something about it. And I think that silence has bearing in many different ways. And I just want to read out to you a small excerpt from the book to give you an idea. Joy mentioned the AIDCI, which is a group of these Chinese internees in Toronto. They formed this association, and about 5 years ago, they made a move. They thought, I mean, they were starting to get ready to tell their story. So about 50 of them got on a bus in Toronto and went to Ottawa to the Indian High Commission, and they wanted to hand over a letter addressed to Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying we would like an acknowledgement and we would like a apology. But before this trip actually took place, there was a lot of discussion, not only among the AIDCI, but among Chinese Indians in India. They got wind of this, and one of them wrote to the AIDCI, and I just want to read out what this person wrote, who prefers to remain unknown. That's also part of the silence. So she writes to AIDCI, we want you to know that this recent India-China standoff over Doklam, which is what happened in 2017 in Doklam, there was some clashes between the Indian and Chinese troops. We want you to know that this standoff has again rattled the community in India, and we are still on tenterhooks. We have been trying our best to remain as invisible as possible so as not to attract unwanted attention to the community. We have had to assuage our elders that 1962 will not happen to us. We are not sure what the demonstration in Ottawa will mean to us here, if it would have any effect at all, but this is just a sincere request from us to be careful about what is said and what is demanded. The last thing we would want here is to provoke the Indian government. Since they can't get back at China directly, I am concerned that they might take it out on us. Already, many of us are on the radar of the Indian intelligence agencies, and I know this because I get frequent visits from them. So this is, to me, summarizes what this is all about. People like Joy were put into this prison camp for no reason except the way that they look, and as an Indian, that's extremely what's a good word? Troubling. Realization for me as a citizen of India. And that's why I wanted to write this book, because I'm tired of this. I'm tired that we've kept silent so long, and I really want this amnesia to be forgotten, if you like. It's time that we talked about this openly, and I think it would do a lot for us, and not just for the community, but for us as Indians to acknowledge and I hope apologize for the story. So that was my motivation for the book.
Thanks, Dilip. You mentioned being a citizen of India, and I think that's a good segue into what I want to bring, what we want to talk about, which is roots and identity. Also get asked a lot of these questions, like what does the community do now that they're not in India? The people who were interned, just to give you a sense, they were mostly second or third generation Chinese Indians. They've been born there. We all speak the language. We don't speak just one dialect. We speak Hindi, we speak Bengali, and in certain cases, in my father's case, he spoke Orao too, because he was playing with the Assamese too, of course, all the people in Assam. So when you talk about that, if you look at me, huge part of my background is Indian. Of course, I'm Chinese, and then of course there's this Western global kind of thing that we all share. So as far as identity goes, I always look at the internment as sort of it was almost taken as a playbook from what the Japanese Americans. That whole implementation, right? So the rounding up of the Chinese, keeping them in a holding cell, and then shipping them off from the east of India to the west of India, was pretty well organized. Like they came quickly. So, for example, anecdotally from my father's company, they came on November 17th, and they took all the men, and so all the men had, most of the men had families. They married local women and their children, and so those people were not taken. So my grandfather had to figure out how to, support them. And then 2 months later, right? So the war ended November 21st, 1962, and my parents and brothers were taken on January 25th, 1963. So 2 months after the war had ended, this was still going on pretty actively. I think the most people, like about in the thousands or almost 2,000 people were taken really early to Rajasthan, to the Kota and then to Rajasthan. And so, so at the registration desk, right? So Michael talks about how, you know, when they register, they have to declare their names, you know, so there's a bit of confusion about how to spell Chinese names, but they had to surrender all their assets, anything of value. And then there was a lot of shock that they could actually speak Hindi, right? And so there was a bit of education happening at the registration desk, like, oh, you know, we've been living here, you know, we've been here for generations, like my dad was born here. And then you also had in Assam, so just to give you a sense of where people were taken, they're mostly the border areas, so Assam and Tinsukia and all that area, and then northern Bengal, what is now currently West Bengal. And so those areas had the most like rounding up of people. And so when you talk about, you know,
not Calcutta.
Calcutta, some, right? Not that many, but mostly were the border areas.
Border areas.
So, so the Assamese families who were taken, they don't look very Chinese, right? And so I write about this one anecdote where there's this. So just also to quickly paint for you what the camp looks like, you know, there are barbed wires internally, like 2 rows of barbed wires, and then on the walls you have barbed wires, and then a 4th level of some sort of protection wires or such. And so they had 4 guard posts, all the time manned, but after 6 p.m., everybody who was not Chinese Indian had to leave the camp because that's when the workday ended. And so the guards were yelling at this guy and saying, "What are you doing in this in the camp?" And so there was a lot of confusion. And the guy said, "Well, you know, I'm here. I'm in the camp." And so, like, when you talk about that, so on the one hand, you have the interning of people who look Chinese, visibly look Chinese, but then does the whole who is a Chinese, who's an Indian? You know, like it really like almost hard to distinguish. So that's a story I feel that really kind of, you know, summarizes like the complexity of the situation or the lack of understanding of, you know, what such an action means.
So as a journalist I'm interested in stories, and I was really also interested in what this did to people who are not Chinese and people like me. What happened to people like me, and why did we? How did we react at the time, and what has happened since? Why have we forgotten this? So just to give you a small idea of that, I'm going to again tell you a story. I think all that I'm any good at is telling stories, so maybe I'll tell you one. This is a man I met in Tinsukia, which is, if you know the geography of India at all, it's fairly east in Assam, quite far east, and it's close to the easternmost point from where these internees were taken. So I had got to Tinsukia, and somebody told me, you got to meet this Dr. Lohit Kumar. I'm never sure how to pronounce that, but I think that's how it's pronounced, Lohit Kumar, who was on that train. And I said, but doesn't sound to me like a Chinese Indian name. But they said, yeah, but he was a doctor on that train. So anyway, that sounded intriguing. So I went to meet this doctor who's still practicing now, 50 years later. And so he tells me that he was a young doctor at the time. He just graduated from the Dibrugarh Medical College, and he was asked, somehow there was an appeal that went out saying there's a train going to Rajasthan, and it's got all these people on it, and we need some doctors on that train to provide medical services if they're needed. So he, as a young doctor, jumped at this chance, and apparently 6 of them were on this train. And they all went, and he told me that the train was filled with all these Chinese-looking people, but the women were all in Assamese dress. They wore something called the mekhla chador. Is that the right way to pronounce it? Okay. And but he said, you know, they all looked Assamese, and the women. He also said to me specifically, the women were like our sisters, whatever that was supposed to mean. Anyway, so they went on this train, and then he got all the way there, and there didn't seem to be much that he did on the way. And then they stayed there a couple of days. The people got off the train, and he got on the train and came back, and then that was the end of that story. But he also, one other thing that he told me is that they sent, there's a direct quote, okay, that they sent doctors along with the train shows that India has some humanity. So I'm just putting that out for you to make your own conclusion. But the really interesting thing was about this time he got tired of talking. He was an older man by this time, so he just retired. I went off to go to sleep, I think. And his son, who was helping him with the practice, talked to me a little bit more. And he said, my father, a few years ago, he read this new book that has come out in Assamese called Makum, which is written by a Assamese writer called Rita Chaudhary, which is about this, a novel based in this story, in this Chinese internment story. And so it's when he read this book, and then when I read it too, he came to me and he said, I like this book, but I know it is fiction. So the son said, yeah, it is fiction, it's a novel, but so why are you telling me that? He says, I know it's fiction because I was on that train. So think of this. This was 50 years after he was on that train, and this is the first time he had told his family that he was on that train. So I don't know whether he had forgotten or he had decided to forget or he didn't think it was important or what, but to me it was a stunning revelation that this man had had this, what seemed to me a fairly intense experience in 1962, an important experience as a young doctor, and he'd just forgotten all about it for 50 years. So to me, that's a sign of this forgetting. And I think through my time connected with this story, I've run into this amnesia, and I'm sorry for underlining it because I really think that's fundamental to the story. This amnesia in different ways again and again. And like I said before, it troubles me. And we have different ways of talking about it, which I hope we will also get to. Yes, Joy.
Thank you, Dilip. One of the things, one of the topics we like to talk about is this visit Lal Bahadur Shastri had made to the camp. At the time, he was the Home Minister, and so my mom always referred to him as Home Minister Shastri. So what happened was about 3,000 Chinese were taken to Deoli camp, and China sent batches of ships, 3 batches of ships to take them back. We're going to take the whole going back to China part. So these ships took whoever wanted to go to China, and my parents opted to stay back because my father really wanted to go back and go back to his livelihood and his life. And so Shastri came and visited the camp, and people were encouraged to go listen to the talk. And even though the story is from my mother's perspective, in talking to the other internees, I know that the young boys tried to. They were teenagers, right? They tried to come as close as they could to Shastri and say a few words. So I know Andy said, Andy Shea, who's in the book, he said, Home Minister, I'm losing out on my education, I can't study, and I think he left it open or what. And so I believe Shastri said, let me see what I can do about it. And so there was a cordial conversation. And then at some point after he had delivered his speech, he said, okay, all of you who are here, I want to let you know, if you want to live in India, you stand out here. And then I think a line was drawn. And all the people who want to go back to China, you stand here. If you choose to if you choose to live in India, you will be released and you will be allowed to go back to your homes and earn your living and all that. And so clearly my parents decided to stay. And so my mother always used to say, he said that, and that was in 1963, and we weren't released till 1967. And she said, we were there for another 4 years. Like, why would he say such a thing? Why would you, why would you promise people in such a terrible situation this type of freedom? Because you have to understand there was no information. Nobody knew when they were going to release. They didn't know any schedule of any activity about leaving the camp. So in the absence of all this, there was a lot of despair and a lot of desolation. And so while I was talking to her, I said something like, "Oh, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri," and she said, "No, no, no, he is the Home Minister." And so we went around talking about that a little bit, and then I realized that in those 4.5 years, she had no idea he had become a prime minister, right? And so she was so taken aback, and my feeling was, oh my God, like you cannot return these years that you take away, because there was no news, anything that came through would be cut up and it literally would fall in little ribbons of strip. So that was the kind of information, like, I think some people figured out that if you sent a letter to China, it would take X number of weeks, and if you sent it to Delhi, it was a little bit easier because the censorship would be a little less, something like that. And so I was just horrified that, I know my mother's story so well, but I still didn't know everything, how it affected her. But Dilip has a different perspective of that same event.
It's not that I have a different perspective.
I mean, sorry. Yes, but you report on it.
So Shastri, like Joy said, went to the camp in 1963 and, made these promises and met the internees and so on. And when he went back to Delhi as a member of parliament, as a Home Minister of India, he had to report to parliament on what had happened. So I found these in the Rajya Sabha, which is our upper house, Rajya Sabha archives. I found this transcripts of what happened in this meeting, in the session when he was asked about the visit to the camp. So in this discussion, there's a member of parliament called J.S. Pillai who gets up and asks how many internees at the Deoli camp, quote, had refused to go to China. So Shastri didn't get up immediately. He asked his deputy, the Minister of State for Home Affairs, who was at that time a guy called R.M. Hajar Navis. So Hajar Navis says 595. So almost 600 internees had refused. They said, we don't want to go to China, just like Joy's family. So Pillai then has a follow-up. Out of 3, or at least out of the people who were talking to Shastri at the time. So then Pillai asks, were they prepared to go to Formosa? That's the old name for Taiwan. So Hajar Navis says, no, they want to remain in this country. And then Pillai asks, actually, how many detainees are there in the camp? And he says there were 1,654 who either said, we want to take the ship, or that they had no opinion, plus 595, which comes to 2,249. So some numbers were bandied about. And then another MP gets up, a guy called Srirama Reddy, who says, about these 595, were they refusing to go to China because that country's government, quote, has been following international gundaism, perfidy, and all that sort of thing. I love this quote because it's almost humorous that you have a language like that being exchanged in Parliament. But anyway, perfidy and all that sort of thing. And this is when Shastri gets up and says, well, I haven't actually discussed exactly this question with the prisoners, but I've inferred that, quote, the present policy of the Chinese government is not acceptable to them, and that they were, quote, happy to remain in India, and that India was a, quote, free country and had a democratic setup. Talking about prisoners that he had just met in Deoli. And presumably he's speaking from personal experience because he's just been in the camp, and he goes on to say that the internees that he met in the camp were, quote again, exceedingly happy. Especially, I found the women and children fully satisfied with the arrangements made and the facilities provided in the camp. Now, one thing we did grow up with, all of us in India, is the idea of Shastri as a man of a statesman of sorts, who had a certain integrity that perhaps subsequent prime ministers, for better or worse, have not had. To see that Shastri spoke like this and is greatly disillusioning to me. But you got to remember that when Joy's family was released in 1967, that was 5 years after they entered, and 4 years after Shastri seemed to have found them exceedingly happy. So this is about Shastri. I want to say a little bit more about the Chinese ships the ships that took some of these people back to China. And I say back to China to underline that we should not be saying back to China, because most of these people were Indians, through generations, and they'd been sent from different parts of India. Their homes were in India. They'd been sent to this camp. So this idea of repatriation and sending them back to China makes no sense at all. And the fact that some of them chose to go is because I think they felt betrayed by India. And when they went to China, it was as foreign a country to them as the United States might have been or Brazil might have been. But they were forced to make lives with a language that they did not speak and in a place that they were not familiar with. So this, I want to underline that also because we often hear now, and this is again a question of these echoes of this episode. We hear so often that people should go back to Pakistan, and you know whom I'm talking about, presumably. And that makes no sense because those people who are being asked to go back to Pakistan had no connection to Pakistan to begin with. So in the same way, when people say people were sent back to China, it disturbs me, and I think it should disturb all of us.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit to the going back to China. I think that also comes out for all, every time there's a border skirmish, I think all the Indian Chinese who are still there in India, they get a lot of that kind of, venom and rhetoric, go back to China, go back home, or in certain cases, there was this guy who was traveling with his mother, and they were in going up north, up to north of West Bengal, and then they were in the train, and they were like yelling at them in Bengali, and so they yelled back in Bengali, and they had quite an argument there. I want to talk a little bit about the effects of the camp. So you can imagine, for a lot of the people I spoke to were teenagers at the time, or pre-teens, and then people as young as 6 years old, right? Michael was 6 when he went in. So all the people who were in school, they completely lost all, they had a huge gap in their education, and it was really, really hard to get back into school. Many had to start working immediately, and it took a long time for them to recover. And I think when you look at them now, they're very successful, and it's also a story of resilience, right? And I feel sometimes that whole resilience is sort of a what's the word, placebo, to say it's okay, they're fine, these people are okay. But it's not, the people who don't talk about it for like 40 years to the people they work with, and it's really hidden and suppressed, and but these people are also very, in their daily lives, they, whenever they gather, they're eating Indian food. Whenever they listen to Hindi music, and like Dilip has a story about, being on the bus, and
I'll tell that story.
So I'll let him tell you that. So not only has it obviously affected the people who were in the camp as youngsters, but it has affected the next generation. I guess I'm sort of in between the next generation and really belonging, because I don't remember anything, but I think about it a lot, and definitely was a driving force to write this book. But I want to talk about Eva, who's Michael's daughter, and when I met her first, she was 19, and she was sort of trying to discover for herself, understand things that she couldn't understand, right? And so she did some research with her relatives, and who she would ask them, what was it like at the camp? And they said, oh, nothing. It was really boring. And it spoke to the tedium of the camp, because there was no education, there was no activities, there was nothing. You were just given food, and you were just expected to sort of make it from day to day. But while I was talking to her, I realized, like she really had to work hard to understand sometimes where her dad was coming from. She felt that there were some things that she couldn't understand, she couldn't touch. And in what it did to her was, she spent her education like learning and discovering, going back to his home village. But it left her with a sense of a doubt about belonging, right? And so she felt, she was going to a school that she felt was very privileged, and the question remained that are you ever safe, with the state? Can you truly belong? And when I wrote the book, that was her feeling. She couldn't expect to be safe and cared for in this country, and so I feel that a lot of people don't talk about it, but all the children at some level, they do say, "Oh, he had a terrible time," but there are other things that are going on.
So let me, two things I'd like to say, there's lots to say, but two more points that I'd like to make before we open it up or whatever. One thing is what Joy just again alluded to, this story that I was going to tell you about the bus. So I was on this bus that I mentioned earlier going from Toronto to Ottawa, with 50 Chinese Indians on the bus, and they were, all in good spirits because they were wanting to hand over this letter to Prime Minister Modi. And at one point, some of them started urging one of the people on the bus, a man called Ying Sheng Wong, who is known to all as Bobby, telling him, Bobby, why don't you sing for us? And apparently Bobby had a good voice, so that's why he had his reputation and he was going to sing. And so here I am sitting, the lone non-Chinese looking person on the bus, thinking this guy is going to start singing and he's going to sing a Chinese song. And that tells you a little bit about the prejudices or stereotypes or whatever it is that we all have in our mind. The person looks Chinese, he's going to sing a Chinese song. And except that Bobby then opens his mouth and starts singing Ajeeb Dastaan Hai Ye. If you all know that, Ajeeb Dastaan Hai Ye, you know that song. Kahan Shuru, Kahan Khatam. So it's an old Bollywood tune that's, I love it. Manzile hai kaun si hai.
Very appropriate.
Exactly. It's so appropriate that I have it as a ringtone on my phone. And not only that, me playing the harmonica.
It's Hindi Urdu both.
Yes, it is.
Manzile
hai kaun si, yeah. So it's Ajeeb, but the interesting thing is, and that's why you say it's appropriate, Ajeeb Dastaan means strange story. And here is this man singing the song called Strange Story in the strangest of stories that I've ever come across, this particular story. So that gives you an idea of how much India meant to these people, because Bobby Wong emigrated from India to Canada in the late 70s, I think?
80s.
Okay, so it had been, 30, 40 years. And he's singing the song, and apparently he's much more comfortable speaking in Hindi than in any other language, including English. So tells you a little bit about what India meant to these people and therefore what this incarceration meant to these people. The other thing I want to talk about is what Ashutosh started with, is the Japanese-American internment. So there's a direct parallel between that story and this story, because the U.S. government in 1942 incarcerated about 100,000, 120,000 Japanese Americans in camps all over the West. The parallel breaks down in this respect, because those people were released when the war was ended. There were many more of them than the 3,000, and in 1988 President Reagan issued an apology and gave them reparations. So that's what this community is waiting for. I don't necessarily think that they're waiting for money as reparations. I mean, after all these years, what could any sum of money really mean to them? But I think an acknowledgement that India did this and an apology is something that I think the community is justified in asking for and expecting. And I have to say I'm not optimistic that they'll ever get it, but I think we have to make efforts to persuade our government to issue that apology. Joy, you want to say anything else?
I think I'll just wait for questions. I think I'm okay.
Okay,
Maybe
good.
Yeah.
We should invite Michael now.
Yeah.
Michael, you wanted to say a few things? Yeah.
Sure.
Please, some more. Yeah. We're being recorded. Would you like
a
to?
special place to speak?
Yeah.
Well, definitely thanks for you all coming, and thanks for your providing this this opportunity to let us speak our experience. When I was 6 years old, I was too innocent to know all the things, and most of the hardships my parents sheltered that. So, but little I know is those experience is what I did, what happened. It's engraved in my mind. It's never go away. So like the cold winter night. It was a really cold night. We would go through the line and do the registration and surrender our all the positions and going to the camp and eating that half-cooked food. So those are the memory. And in the camp is like most kids. Now that you ask the kids, what you do between 6 and 8 years old, what they say, I go to the beach, I go to the river, I go play piano, I go school, I go church. But my life between 6 and 8, I don't have a paper to write, or I don't have books to read. When we have to play soccer ball, there's only one ball. It was on the outside the office, which is a camp office. They let you have the ball once a day, and in early they let you take it, and at the end of the day you have to bring it back. And only the eldest kids get to play, and we just watch. And education-wise, we have a volunteer teacher. Because of without the material, we never did learn anything. For 2 years, I lost my educations. So that was the most precious time in my life. I need to be in learning, and that really affect my future. When I released from the camp, I have a difficulty getting into school because I was overage. Most good school will not take me. And also finally went to the school because my foundations, I have no foundations. Like a house, no foundation. The house is not going to stay long. So I didn't have a good foundation on my education. So I finally at 7th grade, I quit.
Which town did you go back to?
You see, we are not allowed to go back to Darjeeling.
You were not allowed to go back to that.
Not allowed to Darjeeling.
Which is where you came from.
Yes.
So did you go back to Kalimpong?
No,
or
they release us in Calcutta. They make a conditions.
that you will have to go back to Calcutta.
Yeah. So this is still kind of we still trying to figure out. They said sometimes they said between Taiwanese and government and Indian government make a deal. Said if they let these people release in Calcutta, they will take care of it. But the thing is, when we release to Calcutta, we have no help. Not a single soul come to help us. See, that was from bad to ugly. When we went to Calcutta, we have no money, no place to stay, and no help. Like if you go to most of the now I see all the refugees, they have all kind of help. It's bad to say that, but again, they have help. But our situation, we have no help. And with the no help and all that, so really hurt my education. Because of that, and also another thing is the important thing is when 2 years I was in camp, seems like I went to outer space. When I went to Calcutta, I cannot integrate with the most of the kids. What they talk about and what I talk about, I don't know what they talk about, and then they don't know what they don't say. When they told me, I didn't seem like I know that. So that was a very difficult adjustment, and that's what really affect my person as that's lost your lack of confidence. Mm-hmm. Plus you don't have educations. So when I grown up, it's have a very difficult, not having an education and not having confidence. That was not meant to be. It wasn't a war. It wasn't that we take it to camp. I would be not like that. Why I say that? Because I have 10 siblings. My second brother, when the whole family take it to camp, he didn't go to camp because he was studying in out of town. So he escaped. He didn't took him. And my youngest brother, he was 3 years younger than me. So when we released the camp, he was right in time to go into school. So only those two become very educated. I mean, one is an engineer, and my youngest brother is a dentist. And rest of us, probably I have 7th grade. My other brother, my older brother, they even didn't have 4 or 5 grade, and they have to go on to work in the family. So my life of course ruined my father. Daddy's whole life, is financially and everything, and my life I have a very difficulty struggling in my life, and that. And the next generations. It also affects my daughter generation. Because I brought up in a so difficult situation, I become a very very cold-hearted person. Like a really that thing, and really I'm not really exactly cold. I don't have much emotions. Normally I don't hug people, because what I went through, all that, I don't normally. I don't hug people or like I'm not very good on say sorry. I mean, this is honestly. I didn't know until my children have tell me that, and I'm not easily to say sorry or sometimes even say thank you. I'm not good on that. This is how that affect my life.
When did you leave Calcutta finally?
I left Calcutta in 1973. We claimed back our property in Darjeeling. So I was 16 years old, and I was helped to run my dad shoe store. Again, my father was not allowed to go. Even my older brother is not allowed to go to Darjeeling because he was born before 1950. If you're born before 1950, you are not. You are restriction to move around. So only the one who after 1950 can go. So my other brother, they went to run my father's shoe store. Some of them are 12 and 14. So the time when I went there, I was 16, and I left India in 78.
To come to Canada or United States?
No, I went to Europe first. Europe first, and then went back to India, and again I come back, and then I went to come to US. So
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And by the way, that when you talk about language, I didn't speak Chinese until I went to camp. My first language was Nepali. So not only with most of my brother, because we play with the neighbor kids, all speak Nepali, and then when we at home we speak Nepali. So after we take the camp, then we have a mingling with the Chinese kids, and then we learn to speak Chinese. So looking back, so that how it affect my daughter, my children's life too. That. So because of how I act and I behave, and finally after so many years, I realized the lots of mistakes I make. So hopefully my daughter's generation will be. They will be better to educate the children and teach the children. Nowadays, every now and then, when I talk to people, when I ask them, I say, I told them that I was in the camp. I was interned in the camp for 3 years. I will ask them, which country do you think I was interned? Most people say China. It just, of course, part of it is because our intern camp was never told in that. Then I realized, when we were in the camp, the Red Cross only I was there for 2 years. Only time the Red Cross come is one time. They only come one time to visit us, Red Cross. And lots of things they never been told our camp experience. So lots of things I'm looking back on what happened. When they arrest us, when they take us into the camp, it was they executed so well. You know, the way they all come in the same time to knock on the door and then take us in the camp. I mean, it was really executed very well. But when we were inside the camp, they do it really poorly. It's almost like once they put us in the camp, almost like they forgot about us. So lots of things I'm thinking is, our story. Once we die, I'm 66. I'm not. Another 20, 30 years, this thing will be never happen. Look like it's never wiped out from the history. Will feel like this thing's never happened once we die. So I almost just, now they are thinking lots of things what happened, all that. I almost think that that our internee situations almost have somebody have taught Indian government how to handle it, how to take care, how to handle this. I wish John Kennedy. John Kennedy.
Gilbert.
He's still alive. If he's alive, he was a last ambassador in India. Not last ambassador. He was the ambassador during Galbraith.
Galbraith.
Galbraith,
Yeah. I think
John Kenneth Galbraith died
few years ago.
for 4 or 5 years. He's not alive.
Yeah, he probably have lots of information about our internee. So, if some of you need to do research, probably go to his his file, and probably they can find maybe we can find something about our internee. Well, again, thanks for you all for listening to my experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we have 2 commentators. Will speak up to 15 minutes. They may not directly address some of these stories, but the book they've read. Sarah Besky was a colleague here at Brown until some years ago, and she's an anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, and she's now at Cornell. She left Brown for Cornell some years ago. Is an associate professor there, and her research uses ethnographic and historical materials to study the intersection of labor, environment, and capitalism in the Himalayas. She spent a lot of time in Bengal, and I've been trying to persuade her for some years to write a book on Calcutta Chinese. She hasn't yet responded. She has responded in principle, but hasn't given me the book for my series. Sarah.
I have other grants that'll pay me to do other things.
Right.
So but I think I'll be more efficient if I come up here. So
Okay.
And I think in solidarity, with Payal, who has a slide. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Ushu for the invitation, and Stephanie for all of the work that goes into events like this. But really thank you to Joy and Dilip for writing this really powerful and remarkable book. And also thank you, Michael, for sharing your story and also being able to kind of put to a face and a human to these truly powerful narratives in the book. It was a total pleasure. So I'm an anthropologist, and most of my past research has been in Darjeeling, the Doors as well as Calcutta, on the tea industry and associated concerns like Gorkha land, environmental degradation, and climate change. My current and ongoing work, however, is in Kalimpong, which, like Darjeeling and the Doors, is a key site of this book. I read this book then coming from this perspective, but the book is, of course, first and foremost about the experience of life in Deoli during internment, as well as the moments leading up to and hardships faced by internees there. But I read the story of the camp through my work in Kalimpong and Darjeeling. Unlike Payal, I've not written about Deoli explicitly, but my research is very much about the socio and economic conditions that brought Kalimpong into being as a vibrant, often described as cosmopolitan border town, and Darjeeling kind of, is similarly described. But all of this growth of Kalimpong is before 1962. Since 1962, the economy that was built completely on the India-Tibet border trade and border crossings has gone into a tailspin. And all of the allied work that supported that trade has dwindled too. The work of shoemaking, shopkeeping, owning restaurants and cooking, woodworking and carpentry, translating and teaching. All of these forms of work in Kalimpong as well as Darjeeling and across the kind of the border regions that are described in this book were done by members of the Chinese Indian community in places like Kalimpong, but of course beyond. The cosmopolitanness that was often used to describe Kalimpong in the 1940s and 50s in particular cannot be understood without the work and the lives of the Chinese community here in this town. So with regards to the book, my questions sit at kind of somewhat two distinctive scales, right? Scales of analysis. First, most of them are about kind of the micro-political machinations of life in the camp. And then I'll end with some broader political concerns that situate internment, as well as the racialization and targeting of the Chinese community within broader historical and political phenomenon. And these are kind of more regional kind of border questions. What's remarkable about the narratives from Deoli internees is the reoccurrence of certain images, certain sensations, and certain experiences. And I was struck by that in the book, right? And this was brought up in Michael's commentary. The food, the uncooked rice, the inability of camp cooks to cook for that many people, the shift to communal food provision, growing watermelons in drainage ditches. And I really loved to read about all of these acts of social reproduction and forms of kind of mutual aid that shaped life in Deoli and kind of made it happen. But other reoccurring themes were the heat, the wet gunny sacks held up to windows, and also the residence patterns, the blocks and the barracks. Who lived where and when? In what block did they live and who did they live with, right? These were these kind of common narrative tropes in the stories. So food, heat, houses reemerge across these narratives and unfurl like in a kind of shared sense and experience, an experience of suffering and anxiety and also mutuality. And thank you, in particular, Joy, for bringing up that the discussion with your mother about Lal Bahadur Shastri, because that to me was one of the standout narratives of the book that really just sat with me and still sits with me. But the means by which containment and isolation were breached, they were kind of like subverted, was a similarly evoked image that I thought was interesting, specifically through the mediated and censored, quite literally, letters and postcards that moved in and out of the camp, that made the camp as a discrete space. So thinking about the people writing to Deoli from outside of it, I wanted to know more about who did the state come for, right? So who did they come for? Who did they jail and intern? Where were the cuts made? Even in the eyes, especially in the eyes of Deoli internees. In the opening pages, you explain, as we talked about in the opening, that there were 3,000 interned people from the Chinese Indian community, but from a community that numbered tens of thousands. This was sufficient, right? This was a sufficient number in the eyes of the state to stoke fear. Certainly, most Chinese people and families left Kalimpong and Darjeeling, even if they were not interned. The fear was quite real and palpable. But of course, not all of those 3,000 internees were of Chinese descent. Some were Tibetan, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So in addition to the question about who within the community was targeted, I also had questions about who was able to get out before others. As described in the book, there were voluntary repatriations, again brought up in the opening comments, to China, a place that was absolutely not their home. Many of these internees who left on boats to China left Deoli before those who said they wanted to stay in India, right? Before they left the camp before it. But beyond that, some people were released before others, right, from the camp and resettled within India, again, particularly Calcutta. First, a couple of children, then a family, and so on, right? So who kind of got to leave and why? Right, why, like how, I was kind of curious more about that. And I ask this because in my pandemic-induced immobility, I spent a lot of time reading newspapers from Kalimpong from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Actually, the English language weekly newspaper, the Himalayan Times, had to stop publishing in February 1963 when the editor explained that he could no longer get sponsors and materials, let alone readers, for his for this kind of weekly magazine, right? Many of the sponsors are the Chinese businessmen in Kalimpong at the time, but also lots of people were leaving for a fear that was stoked, within and beyond the Chinese community. So as I was reading the book, I went back to find this one article that I remember reading about Deoli. It was from December 19th, 1962, written from New Delhi in an attempt to assuage claims that by China that internees were being mistreated. Right? The title was "No Ill Treatment of Chinese in India." Not the case, but the article notes the Red Cross visit, but it also describes how camp officials would, quoting, screen all of the inmates at the Deoli camp and release those who are not considered a security risk, end quote. So I totally understand that many of the internees and the people who kind of constitute the narratives of this book were children at the time of internment. And actually I would like to maybe talk about that as something that kind of creates the narrative and creates the narrative in this particular way. That so many of the kind of first person narratives are from children remembering a place and a past that is kind of completely, shaped by their kind of beingness as children. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about how the idea of this security risk, as it was described, was thought about and negotiated within the camp. What made someone or some family a continued security risk? And what made them okay to release, and when? This was a question that was also stoked by a detail that the Park Restaurant family, and for those of you who work in the region, right, the Park Restaurant is a particular institution, right, a dominant institution that people know well. But the detail that the Park Restaurant family was released relatively early. We have an idea of the notion of the security threat applied broadly to the Chinese, but also maybe parenthetically and Tibetan community. But I wanted to know more about how it was negotiated in the camp and on an individual and family level, right, case by case by case. And this leads me to kind of more questions about the family. The text primarily describes whole families being interned. There are a few cases in which one parent was away when the police came in the middle of the night, or a brother is away at school. But for the most part, multiple members of a household, including children, specifically children, were imprisoned. But there's also mention of the many people brought by themselves, right, as individuals to the camp, particularly single men. How significant of a population were these single men? Were many of them repatriated to China and maybe hard to identify, hard to kind of get at empirically? Were many of them arrested in the run-up, actually before November 1962, as so-called anti-nationals, and subsequently brought to Deoli? Were many of these single men Tibetan? Right, this kind of family and individual was something that I was kind of curious about with regards to internment. With that, I would also like to know more about the internment of Tibetans and Tibetan families. Both as security threats, but also because the book opens up with, and you enter it into your comments as well, that internment and deportation was animated by both, quote unquote, looking Chinese, generally, kind of in a general sense, but also being a member of the Chinese Indian community in a specific sense. But in 1962, I don't think this is what you're saying in the book, right? But is there? What's going on with this looking Chinese generally and this community identification specifically? Right? There's not necessarily a consolidation of community identity around being a security threat, whereby Chinese and Tibetans are being kind of, conflated and consolidated. But there is, in the book, in the narrative, a kind of and Tibetans ellipsis that I wanted to kind of know more about in parts of the book. Tibetans are and are actively constructed at this time as a security threat for much different reasons by both India and China right now in the 1960s. And they're a risk by kind of virtue of the fact that they were seen as a threat by both countries at the same time, right, the Tibetan community, a kind of geopolitical football. That said, about Deoli, my question is, is there something to say about the cohabitation or different experiences out, in space, perhaps of Tibetan families in Deoli, or the relationship between different communities interned at the camp? Right? How is that negotiated in space? How is that negotiated through food, through all of these acts of social reproduction that you describe within the Chinese Indian families that you're talking, that you work with? And with that, and knowing, again, most of your interlocutors are children at the time, how did people see and describe the events leading up to November 1962? Again, obviously we see this with, especially with Dilip's kind of chapters about that kind of historically contextualize this, but from the perspectives of internees themselves, how do we see this in, how do the internees historicize this, this process? Did people contextualize their experiences in the growing arrests of, again, those so-called anti-nationals, again, usually Chinese or Tibetan men, for the months leading up to November 1962, in places like Kalimpong and Darjeeling and across the Doors? Internment was often described in the text as a stark rupture, right? It was experienced as a stark rupture for internees, right? Particularly right, from the perspective of your interlocutors. And again, I know there's a lot of attempt to historicize this, but what I'm kind of pointing to is in the first person narratives, right? The internment is an event, a stark rupture from a time before, which is interesting in and of itself, in the way that internment is remembered as this kind of rupture, as a stark rupture that that events did not foreshadow. Okay, so now just to kind of close, I want to kind of zoom out just a little bit. The book paints a very clear picture of why Chinese Indians were marked and marginalized at this particular time. But I wanted to know more about why these places, right? And this was brought up a little bit in the comments we just heard. Why were they arrested from the places that they were and not others? As you describe in the book, people are arrested from the margins of the state. Not in Calcutta. Chinese families in Mumbai, nobody came for them. Certainly the margins are where the state is most palpable and citizenship is most in question. But how did the internees think about these cuts? Think about the geographies of difference that they themselves are subject to. That the arrests in November 1962 were generally only from the border districts in West Bengal and Assam, right? How was this thought? And so I'm thinking here, too, about cultural studies scholar Prem Podar's work and the writing he's done with Lisa Zhang, right? Prem significantly grew up in Kalimpong. The move to make not only some people, but some places into security threats is not only conditioned by the way that India sees its margins and its minorities. China and India have been linked in these places, Kalimpong, Darjeeling, the Doors, Kolkata, in particular, by this overland trade route from Lhasa to Calcutta that ran right through the spaces from which people were taken. In both Chinese and Indian print media in the 50s and 60s, Kalimpong is this hill station, right, a mountain town. And this is the way it's described in the 50s. The 1950s also, too, saw Tibetan refugees pouring into places like Kalimpong, and more so as the decade moved on. And in the 50s, for the first time since the turn of the century, the China-India trade, specifically the wool trade, starts hiccuping as the market pivots along with Cold War alliances. And with that influx of Tibetans and visits like the Dalai Lama, Kalimpong and its environs become an object of scrutiny for the Chinese state, but also the Indian state. By 1959, not only Zhou Enlai, but also Nehru is calling the whole region, Kalimpong and Darjeeling specifically, a nest of spies. On the question of significance of place and the border, it's perhaps important to note that those imprisoned at Deoli were also not allowed to resettle, as Michael described, not allowed to resettle in these 5 border districts of West Bengal or Assam. So 1962 is so often thought of as an economic event or a political event, even in the hills, right, of Kalimpong and Darjeeling. one that has drastically reshaped life there. But what this book draws our attention to is the fact that that border wars and the very notion of the border itself between India and China are, of course, not just a physical line in space. The border is very much in Deoli, it's in Rajasthan, it's in the past, it's in the present, and it's in people's memories. The imagery of the border, the notion of a line in space, makes it quite easy to forget about how the violence of the border is experienced in protracted ways. In the inability or the ability or inability to make a living, in life lived in the wake of violence done in the name of state security. The border and its protection, its securitization, and its negotiation conceals these experiences, right? In what Dilip calls amnesia. It conceals these experiences at the same time it rationalizes human suffering. The violence of war, state power, and the very idea of racialized, denigrated difference are all obviously still felt by the people and families who we meet in this book. It is also still felt by residents of the Eastern Himalaya and the Northeast when they travel anywhere in India and their citizenship is questioned because they look Chinese, quote unquote, right? Like as something that they are told all the time. So in the move to mark, discipline, punish, and imprison those deemed other by virtue of nothing other than their otherness is not something of the past. Ma and de Souza eloquently close this book with the fact that, with this fact, right? And the camp, and also kind of stress that the camp is always already a state, a space and a state of exception. But it is in drawing attention to the histories of imprisonment at Deoli, also rooted in fear-mongering and notions of security, that we can highlight the violence and absurdity of the present, not only at the margins of the state, but across contemporary India. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for emphasizing in particular the question of how were the internees chosen, what logic was deployed, and what proportion, if we can think of it that way, of internees were actually Tibetans. Very important questions I think you're asking. And I hope Dilip or Joy would have something to say about that. On the numbers, this is a tale of suffering, and sometimes numbers don't belong in a tale of suffering. But Sarah mentioned hundreds of thousands. Now, so here are the numbers from the book, actually. Tens of thousands, yeah. Here are the numbers from the book. This is right in the beginning, page 3. Page 3, there's a very big preface, but of the main text. The 1871 census found 574 Chinese in Calcutta and 531 in Bombay. So Bombay had a substantial presence at that time. The 1901 census listed 1640 in Calcutta alone, and then we don't have the numbers about Bombay then. And at the end of the World War II, the British colonial government estimated there were 26,250 Chinese in India, presumably Calcutta, Kalimpong, Darjeeling, Tinsukia, and Bombay. I met a few Chinese in Bombay, right? Yeah, so that's not, especially in the restaurant business. Yeah. Just to suggest some stats which don't necessarily belong, when suffering is analyzed, belong to the domain of analysis, but since it was mentioned, tens of thousands. But the question of how the cuts were made, right? How the state applied the cuts. Perhaps someone will speak. Our next commentator has worked. When she gave me her, we knew this. That's why we invited her. Her articles on the Chinese in India. She is an associate professor of sociology and chair of sociology department at Smith College. Works on a number of issues, but the most important here, for our purposes, is her focus on the Chinese minority of India, its persecution, incarceration, and disenfranchisement. Payal. Oh.
Is the warm greetings, everyone, and many thanks to Ashutosh and Stephanie for making this event possible. Joy, I do not have the words that are enough to thank you for this book, for giving life to this work and for documenting affidavits of truths with which a nation of 1 billion is yet to reckon. And I thank Dinesh for taking on with joy this work, as I have said elsewhere, of researching further this history with respect and humility and not leave it entirely to Chinese Indians.
Can I just point out that it's Dilip and not Dinesh? I don't want to be
Oh,
confused with that.
I'm sorry. Very sorry. I renew my thanks to you. Maybe it was the requirement that I was resisting against that all be called Dilip.
I would never like to be called Dinesh.
No. Yes, I completely understand. And I also want to thank Michael for speaking truth in the face of all the difficulties that you mentioned. It could not have been easy then or now. Thank you. The word book does not fully capture this work. Reading through the narratives, you see that Deoliwallahs is a breathing archive of lives. It is a keeper of memories, remembrance, grief, and the agency of Chinese Indians, and it bears evidence also of nationalism's lethality. This book is also a map that will forever change your relationship to places in your life. I grew up in Calcutta and have lived the last 10 years between Sikkim and Massachusetts, and my in-laws are in Assam. The grids of the Queen of the Mission School is merely a block away from my high school. The FRO, Tangra, Henry's shop in Newmarket, Nathula, Nagaon's Chinnapatti will speak a fuller account to you of India's history and one's life in it. For me personally, this book marks the end of a very long wait, more than 20 years, I would say. And surely, for the tens of thousands of fellow Chinese and Deoliwallahs who suffered disenfranchisement, prejudice, harassment, and dispossession during and after the war, this wait has been much longer yet and of a very different significance altogether. In 1999 or 2000, while in graduate school, I saw the film Fire at a film screening. Perhaps some of you will remember it cast Shabana Azmi, Nandita Das, Javed Jafri, and Kulbhushan Kharbanda. I was deeply unsettled by the representation of the Chinese family in the film, Julie and her father in particular, who had speaking parts as mere props and devices, but with absolutely no accounting of why this family felt the way they did about living in India. In a fit of anger, I started to write a graduate seminar paper which took me to the library for more research. There, I stumbled upon a series of government documents, white papers, and collections of diplomatic letters exchanged between the governments of China and India around 1962 and beyond. And there, in a footnote, I found a reference to the central internment camp in Deoli, and a second camp in Nagaon, Assam. I won't get into the details about the paper which later came out in the journal China Report, but will say that the next years, and perhaps even the day when I met Joy in Stanford and today at Brown, had been decided for me by that one footnote. The people and the book, Deoliwallahs, speak for themselves, so I will not talk about my research at length here. But I will share with you two important ideas, one having to do with numbers, as Ashutosh rightly pointed out, numbers don't belong in accounts of suffering. And second, equally haunting, like the question of numbers, an image that I will show you in a little bit. So I get asked often why the number of internees that you see in Deoli. And based on some official statistics published by the government of India, I have a number, 2165. A place to start questioning the detention, but is a political one. Why even 2,000 or 20 or 150? The number of detainees at 3,000 or 2,000 plus in Deoli signals, first and foremost, the absolute power of the state to arrest and detain based on what it deems appropriate and feasible. And it is this power that contributed to Deoli's final head count, which could have been 1,000 or even 10,000. The characteristics of people ultimately sent to the camp did not signal any specific conditions that explained their internment on the basis of markers that could distinguish them from those who were jailed elsewhere or were free but under surveillance. Those interned represented a cross-section of the community, which included people that one might see as non-threatening, in large numbers, infants, children, the elderly, and non-Chinese family members of mixed ethnic families. Counterparts to the camp's entire population could be found elsewhere in places like Assam or West Bengal, undergoing other forms of state repression or public harassment, but free nonetheless, or in local jails. The final count of detainees in Deoli thus does not represent a calibrated figure, or its logic is contained nowhere in its summation. The number cannot explain each person's individual detention, nor can it explain the total number detained. The memoirs help us understand why it is not the total tally of detainees, but rather the fact of detention itself that reveals the centrality of the state's experiments with its own sovereignty. The size and scale of the detention that we see in Deoli were perhaps secondary to the symbolic value contained in organizing and giving form to the project of incarceration itself. And the final thing I'd like to talk about is the text image that you will see speaks the same language of cold calculations, untruths, denial, and self-serving justifications that continue to stand in the way of an official apology. And equally or more importantly, a reckoning by everyday Indians, people who live in India, with Deoli and Chinese Indians first and foremost, and next with Deoli's ongoing afterlife into the 21st century. So as you will see here, the government of India claimed that the camp was set up in a healthy region where the weather is temperate with proper humane level facilities, that they were following the regulations and requirements of the Geneva Convention and were supplying to the detainees exactly 2,655 calories per day. The list of the standard diet is attached. I'll show you in a second. Additional rations are mentioned for children under 12 years of age, that there was a hospital and doctors and so on and so forth. And here is the calculation that I was referring to. It is one of denial, and to this day, it signifies how the state can and does measure things up in ways that are fundamentally inhuman and dehumanizing. You can see the quantity of rice in ounces with their caloric value, vegetables, meat, etc., down to the ounce of salt that the government may have given in rations. So I will leave it at that, and perhaps we can discuss this later. Thank you. I seek your apology for the horrible slip of tongue. I was almost in tears.
It's
so I
happened
hope
before.
You can, but
Many
it's
times. That's okay.
unpardonable.
No, it's okay.
It's not okay. You're being very gentle.
So, Dilip and Joy, would you like to respond to any of the comments you heard, or so let's leave it to you, and then let's see where then we'll invite questions from the audience. Yeah.
Okay, so I was going to answer like who did they come for, you know?
Okay, go ahead.
And then speak whatever little I know about the
Tibetans.
Tibetans, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
You want to go with that?
Sure.
And I'll
Yeah. Here's a list of some questions. So I'm going to talk about how people were selected for the camp, you know, the 2,100 number. So as far as I know, all the people who had Chinese passports were taken, right? And a lot of them, they were born before 1951, so they didn't have access, they didn't have a path for citizenship. And then, of course, the British government also didn't allow. And so in order to be not stateless, I think, you know, at some point they became Chinese passport holders. So at least anecdotally from my company, those were the people who were taken, right? All the carpenters were Chinese and they had Chinese passports and they were taken. My parents had Chinese passport, they were also taken. And then in certain cases, it wasn't very, it might have been organized, but it wasn't very consistent,
Yeah.
right? So either they'll take the families and not take the families. And that sort of goes back to, like, the distribution of Chinese were in either Calcutta or in those regional areas, so like in Assam and Darjeeling and Kalimpong. So I think that's what, according to me, that's what drove, in our research, that's what drove the incarceration from those groups, right? And so I think it was also efficient in my thinking of this, you know, efficient to go into one place and just pull everybody in instead of like scattering all over the place. However, I do know of somebody in Madras, Chennai, and in Bangalore who were taken. So I'm sure there was a list going on. I'm sure people were identified. We've heard of, you know, certain people identify certain people as, and then they themselves were in the camp. So.
Are you saying that most of the internees had Chinese passports? Or are you saying all of them had Chinese passports?
Not all of them.
No, yeah.
Some of them. So
Some of them had
yeah.
Chinese. And many internees had Indian passports.
No,
Right?
or,
Or no
yeah,
paper.
or no papers. Yeah,
Or no papers.
Stateless. I think the stateless people are, you know, definitely targeted. And so, like a Chinese guy, his family would not have a Chinese passport, but they were taken in certain cases.
Okay.
So, not very consistent. So that was what I had for that one. And then I did want to address, like, the number of Tibetans that were in the camp.
Yeah.
And from my research, I heard there was 200, about 200, and these folks were caught at the border, right? And either there's distrust of who's coming across the border and maybe perhaps a spy, but also it shows you at registration what that confusion was, because at registration they also had to explain who they were, right? And so, you know, they were generally seen as Chinese because they're more Chinese looking than not Chinese looking. I think that had something to do with it, but they were just. I heard that they were picked up at the border. Some were released pretty early, and then a handful were kept till the end, and they continued to live in Deoli, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Incidentally, when we were teenagers in Delhi, we near Delhi University, we ate Chinese food in Tibetan dhabas.
Yeah,
Tibdabs.
yeah.
They were called Tibetan dhabas,
Yeah.
and we, as teenagers, did not make any distinction. The distinction came to us later when we started reading about
Yeah.
this matter. Right? So we ate Chinese food in Tibetan dhabas near
Without
Delhi
even
University.
thinking about it.
Huh?
Without even thinking.
Without
about
even thinking about it.
Momos, right? Not
Momos or noodles.
No.
No,
They were
no.
not Tibetan. Tibetan food was not supplied there. There was the noodles and
Fried rice.
hot and sour soup and and egg noodle soup, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll come to the questions. Yeah, Dilip wanted to say something.
Actually, I just wanted to react to, you started by saying, numbers are not appropriate in this story
In a tale of
suffering.
suffering, Sometime, not always, Okay, go ahead. Say
So
something.
actually, in some ways, I want to disagree with that because I think the numbers that you put up on the screen and these numbers about, people ask, they say, well, how many were in the camp? And only 3,000. Well, the Japanese were 100,000. So, and then they say, well, so maybe this wasn't so bad. And so I think
That was the reason
Yeah.
I thought stats were not particularly useful, because
Yeah.
you can always say that right now in Xinjiang you have 1 million incarcerated. I
right.
think once you say 1 million is more important than 3,000,
Exactly.
then that becomes a terrible way to analyze
Yeah.
suffering. I think that's the thing.
But I think what the numbers do is what Hannah Arendt called, famously the banality of evil. Look
Yeah,
at these
correct.
numbers we put up there, and the Indian government tries to make out that we treated these
Right.
prisoners so well by giving this long list of, down to what, quarter ounce.
Quarter of
ounce
curry.
I mean,
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And milk, buffaloes and cow.
and so you add it all up, you get 2,642 or whatever it is, and people say, wow, yeah, okay, they've got so many calories. But the fact that the government has to put together a list like this is self-telling. And I feel like, and I think that should be, I mean, I wish we should make, put this out in public and say, look at what our government did. Here we were giving people in the prison this many calories, but is that a measure of how we treat people? So I mean, it's something that happens all the time with governments. They put out statistics to make out that they've done things well. So anyway, that's the point I wanted to make. Yeah.
I wanted to, say that, so since I was a baby, my rations were cut in quarters. So I got 1 egg in a month. And so my brothers got like an egg every other week, something like that, right? And then you got 5 rupees to spend for, but this, whatever oil they said was not true. There was like no oil. I don't know how they come with 2,600. I think you'd really gain a lot of
lies.
weight, right?
No, calories.
Yeah,
Calories, yeah.
tons of calories, like you're eating pizzas, that kind of stuff, like that kind of food. And then I did want to talk about food because I was contacted by this young lady sort of a couple years ago, and she was talking about, oh, I want to talk about the food you ate out there. And she was, I don't know for what it's worth, she was like, oh my God, did you get Chinese food? I was like, no, we got, whatever food everybody else gets. And she said, and you were forced to eat food that you're not familiar with. And so I never thought of it that way. But, there was no exception. When you're in the camp, you got this kind of food. And then yesterday, another food thing, somebody messaged my niece who got us into the Columbia talk and said, I just want to know what kind of food they had, because in 1962 and through 1967, there was a famine. And I was famine where? In Bengal. Because I didn't, because they clearly had to feed like 500 people for a while. So.
No, I have studied famines, and so there's been no famine in India since 1942. That was
The Bengal
the
famine.
Bengal famous
So I don't know
famine.
where that came from.
62 to 67, food production. The biggest famine in the history of the world was in China. Between 1958 and 1961, during the Great Leap Forward,
Right.
when now the estimate suggests 45 million people died, 15 million per year.
Right.
Bengal famine, the biggest in India, killed about 1 million.
Right.
But that was during British India, right?
Yeah.
That was not after independence. There hasn't been a famine, but 61, 62, 63, food production declined precipitously, and food started coming from America under Public Law 480. So these were, by 1965, 10 million tons of wheat was coming from Kansas and Kentucky to feed Indian cities. But by 1967-68, India's Green Revolution had started bearing results, and production turnaround took place. By 1971, India stopped actually importing wheat from United States. That's how big a change Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP Green Revolution there created.
In that one
so
decade.
So the period of internment does coincide with declining food production in India,
All right.
but not a famine.
Not a famine.
It is, but it coincides with the last days of the famine in China.
Yeah.
Right, that was the Great Leap Forward famine. So, these are things that those of us who do political economy know very well. So
Yes.
that's the reply to.
Got
The,
it. Okay, I will let that person know. I'm like, I never heard of it.
questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a John Kenneth Galbraith question.
John Kenneth Galbraith question. Okay.
I had the opportunity to meet him and his wife in Cambridge about 10 years before they died, because he died in 2006, she died in 2008.
Oh,
And when I went to their
that long
home that
ago.
That long,
afternoon,
I see.
there were people from India there, and he intimated to me that he still maintains social contacts with people from India
That's-
that he met during his ambassadorship in India. I just want to know, how much did he know, or his wife? Did Robert McNamara know anything about this, or anybody in President Kennedy's cabinet? Or do you think that maybe the lingering effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 could have overshadowed this? Because I just can't fathom that he wouldn't have said anything about this.
Galbraith in particular?
Yeah.
I have no idea, actually. It's a good question.
If you read the John Bush Riddell books, right? John Galbraith knows very well. He's the one talk about the chicken neck. About chicken neck, that little area,
Yeah,
that one, that he's the one. He's the one suggests that we need to protect that chicken neck. If if the China run over that way, the whole northeast of India is gone.
That's correct.
So John Gilbert have mentioned that.
See, John Kenneth Galbraith was a Harvard professor
Yeah, comes.
when he was appointed by Kennedy to be ambassador to United States ambassador to India, and he developed long-term fondness for India and visited quite often, right?
Yeah.
Has accounts of his. There's a book called, I think, Ambassador's Journey. I think it's called. That's his
I
account
think there's
of.
also a book called Birds in My Indian Garden.
Right. And their staff at home in Cambridge often had people from India, so they would have their staff that looked after the home in Cambridge was often from India. It is highly unlikely that he did not know about the camp.
I would think so, yeah.
I don't think in Ambassador's Journey is mentioned, because I've read it. There is no mention of the Chinese internment.
But are there any other papers of his that are with any?
It's possible that
university?
there are some papers somewhere in
Harvard?
his son is a University of Texas economics professor. Maybe he has them. But in his own account of India, and he wrote quite a bit about India, he never mentioned this.
Can I add something on that point? So this is not directly in response to whether this individual knew about it or not.
Yeah.
But I would imagine, in the context of the Cold War, there was very little that would have escaped the eyes of US surveillance, number one. Number two, all the books I referred to, the government documents, Ministry of External Affairs, Information and Broadcasting, all the letters that were exchanged, those books were purchased with PL 480 funds.
Yes.
Correct.
And each one of them are stamped as such. So I would imagine that would mean that somebody read those books in the US government.
That's right.
Because that was the whole point of spending Indian rupees in India to purchase books.
The purchase book.
That's correct. Though a lot of those books came to libraries of the United States. I think I saw even at Harvard
There's a rubber stamp.
with stamp,
Yeah.
PL 480.
All the books
Yeah.
I have looked at have that stamp, which is ironic.
Yeah, PL 480 funds
Fund
Were used for
allowed
the-
to purchase
from-
the books.
Right.
So in other words, I think it's a very good question, but in all probability, the best speculation would be that he knew, but he didn't write about it.
They'll write over.
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was in September.
Right.
Of 62.
So I was thinking
Yeah.
maybe that may have overshadowed, or maybe it might have been a factor in terms of knowing.
But he was not dealing directly with Cuban Missile Crisis. He was in Delhi.
Right.
He was not dealing directly with that. He was very involved with. Nirupma Rao has written a book about India-China relationship until 1963, 49 to 63. The former ambassador, Indian ambassador to China, Indian High Commissioner to China, former Indian ambassador to the United States. The book was released a few months ago. And she does mention that United States of America was very involved in U.S.-China, what was happening between India and China, was very keenly observing after 1959.
Oh.
After when
And
the
why that?
relationship really sours.
At that date in particular, because the
Because
relationship.
it really sours, it's
Okay.
clear that something terrible is going to happen.
Okay.
War is likely, something like that.
Okay.
And there is also speculation that we cannot provide documentation of that. American papers about that must be already out because I think you can keep them hidden
50
keep them
years.
secret for 30 years, is it?
50,
American law?
50.
Huh?
50 years, I think.
No,
Oh.
American
know.
law would be 30.
Then it would be
Yeah.
public
So-
now.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to say was I didn't make a note of where I read this, but I did read that Kennedy had had a conversation with some Indian officials, and he was ready to deploy like bombers
Yeah,
to
so
help
I was
the
saying
situation,
that the speculation. I don't know whether we can document this, what you're saying, but America was perhaps if Mao's Chinese forces had advanced significantly further, America would have come to India's help in a military way, not just politically.
And there were assurances given to that
Yeah,
Yeah,
effect?
so we can't document
We
this
can't
beyond their speculations.
Yeah.
Someone will have to research those papers, or if those papers are already out. If they are not out, then we have to wait until they are
They're out,
declassified.
yeah.
Right. But that speculation in international relations circles has been there for a very
For a
long
long
time.
time.
And also the speculation that Mao was aware that might happen. That's why he pulled back.
Pull back.
Yeah, that would.
Makes sense.
That's why he pulled back, yeah.
You know that China and India never declare war, as long as it is only conflict. So our internee, right, is a violate the Geneva Convention Treaty, 1949 Geneva, 49-47 Geneva Convention Treaty, because India was one of the signers country. Because you see, because we are. If it's a declared war, right, then you can take if you're a Chinese citizen, you can take them to
Are you
Kenya.
saying this war was not declared? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
no,
So you mean it was like
it's only
Putin
conflict.
saying it's a special military operation, not a war?
Maybe.
I don't know. I don't know, Michael, if it's true. I think it was a war.
I've heard this before too. Maybe this is at least that's how like I've heard this also as I mean especially in Darjeeling, right, that like the qualities of this of 1962 were such that like that war was never declared. It was
Border conflict.
it was a conflict, not a war.
Yeah,
I mean I'm just saying I've actually this totally resonates with what I've heard as well.
So
That's
what?
why you say, that's why you know that they were raised questions about our internal situation because
Refugees.
Yeah, if once they declare war and then
I see the point.
is a Geneva Convention treaty was involved,
Applied.
then our internal issue will never ignore. But because we are ignoring because they nobody bring out the Geneva Convention treaty on behalf of us.
We were never.
The other thing is India was defeated badly
Yes.
in that war, and there was a lot of sympathy in the world for
Yeah.
India's plight. India was badly defeated.
Defeated. Yeah.
But that's exactly what Payal is saying, it's the power of the state and the individual. Like, I mean, this is going on right now. It's individuals suffer in regional conflicts.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that is so upsetting about, this whole situation is how forgotten and invisible this internment is. It's appalling and a blot to history.
On amnesia, there is a very well-known scholar, Ashish Nandi,
Yeah.
who was studying for long years. He hasn't published the book, but has only a paper on it. Still trying to figure out whether he should write a book about it. So he started studying the children of India's partition and tracked down, by children I mean that not infants per se, but those who were affected very seriously by partition, had to leave their homes in Pakistan. He also started interviewing people in Karachi because that's where the largest concentration of Indian Muslims was. And then he himself is from Kolkata. There the border crossings were not that many, you know. And he gave a lecture here 10 years ago from the only paper that has appeared from that project, and described, and it had about 7,000 interviews. I hope someone can turn it into a book. I mean, that's a lot of interviews. There are very few left who were from that generation. So the Ford Foundation gave him a grant to interview the last remaining
partition survivors
from that generation, and that turned out to be, he could document 7,000 or something, or of the 10 or 12,000 that could still be alive. This was around 2000 or so. And he describes several interviews in Delhi where the wives did not know what had happened to their husbands, and after 40 or 50 years, during the interview, 1 hour into the interview, all of a sudden floodgates opened, and they started narrating things. The husbands started narrating things that the wives had never heard for 50, and after being married to them for 30 years, 35 years, had never heard. Husbands never talked about it. And during the interview, they came out. So he was discussing, I think, 10 or 15 such interviews. And he's a psychoanalyst. He's trained in psychology. So this was while you were talking about amnesia, I was reminded of that. And the claim that Nandi was making is that some experiences are so traumatic that people would like to expel them from the memory as a way to live life again,
This is
rather than be permanently injured and handicapped by those memories.
I think this applies also to some of the perpetrators who killed people. They also did.
In fact, many of the husbands for the first time described how they killed.
Telling.
I think it was either all of them or many of them described how they killed, and the wives were
astounded.
completely astounded. They had not heard those stories.
Amnesia.
As a way to redefine life, as a way to live life normally again.
You can understand that.
Questions? Are there other questions from? We have 5 more minutes. Can someone tell me, so can we return to the question of Tibetans there? Do you have any knowledge of what the relationship between Tibetans and the Chinese Indians were?
I think in the camp there were separate quarters. Like they were kept separately from the Chinese. I don't know that much. I know my mother had somebody she spoke with, and they worked together on whatever household things. No, I don't know. I don't know that much. That part is really not explored.
Were there, on the whole, you would know this, or others would know this who have studied this more, were there on the whole more Chinese Indians living in border areas or in Calcutta? Definitely Calcutta. But Calcutta Chinese were not taken to these camps.
Some were.
Some were.
Not as many as from the...
Right.
Proportionately less.
Also from Assam. There was a huge Chinese Indian population all over Assam that were also rounded up.
Calcutta and Mumbai, all other area, that one, if somebody had on the finger, and they were, but they didn't take it to the Delhi camp. They take it to the local
Jail held in captivity.
Yeah.
But the border one is the one. But again, Calcutta ones was if the conflict or war didn't stop, right? If it keep China advancing, they would took the Calcutta because when we were in the camp, I remember the
America would have come in by then.
Yeah, I was
Almost certainly. I don't think they would have been allowed to take Calcutta. America would have intervened.
No, they would have come for people. They would have come for, they would have interned people in Calcutta.
Like I said,
Yeah.
if China had come.
Yeah.
No.
So what happens when you come to the camp and then they started clearing all the land beside the camp.
Yeah.
Mhm.
All the tree they've been bulldozing, and they're making room for another camp. That was the saying that they
They're
build more
expanding.
camp to accommodate more from the more.
And I want to add something to this discussion, which is, I think it would be inappropriate to place disproportionate responsibility on the state. Let us not forget, everyday Indians took it upon themselves to participate in various forms of
Vandalizing and
pointing, go catch that person, burning homes, burning offices, throwing tenants out, outing students in their schools. So in terms of the totality of that experience, the state and the citizens, quote unquote, citizenry went hand in hand.
As
So
happens
There
yes,
was
today.
90% support for Japanese American internment, only
Yeah.
10% opposed.
so that's why I'm saying
That's
that.
also, these are very difficult times, and what did you say? The lethality of nationalism. The lovely term you use, very, very appropriate. Nationalism and lethality comes out in times like this. So yes, the citizenry, but it's the job of the state to stop the
stop that.
citizenry from
Yes,
expressing
exactly.
prejudice. I mean,
But
it's
it's
the job
also
of the
the
state
job
to
of
be
the
maintain neutrality of some kind. The job of the state, right?
Theoretically,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
the state that also manufactures consent
Yeah.
to participate in the lethality of the state.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Theoretically, a modern Bavarian state is supposed to maintain religious neutrality, ethnic neutrality, racial neutrality, but modern states repeatedly violate that.
Yeah.
That's
As we're
also
seeing
true.
now.
Huh? As we're seeing
As
now,
we're
yeah.
saying now.
Right? Repeatedly violate that. But we should never give up on the principles. It's not the job of
No,
the state, modern
definitely.
state. The job of the state is to maintain
Absolutely.
neutrality.
If we lose that, what do we
Vis-a-vis
have?
religion, vis-a-vis race, vis-a-vis
You have to
ethnicity.
keep reminding them
Right.
of that.
Right. But the number of times that precept has been violated is just it's simply too huge. The number is too large. So I think on that note, let me thank Joy, Dilip and Michael for giving us this truly remarkable account of a forgotten chapter of Indian history, which we ought to know more about and which ought to generate reflection.
Can we say that, for what it's worth, we have a few copies of the book available for anyone who wants to buy?
Oh,
Of course, we don't have much of an audience, but if
Yeah.
anybody does want to buy, we have.
sure. If you want a signed copy, by all means, we are going out to the reception, and then
Oh.
you can get your signed copies of from Dilip and not Dinesh, Dilip.
My
and
apologies.
Joy. Thank you all very much. Thank you,
That was awful.
and thank you to Payal.